Thanks very much, Matthew. So it's challenging, but not as bad as you may think. Ailish, let's start with you. If I'm right in thinking, you've been rejigging your portfolio, selling a few of your assets. So can you tell the audience, what have you been disposing of and why?
Sure. Obviously, changes in the market are not unanticipated, and we've been looking at this. Part of our ongoing process at Land Securities is to review the insight, understand what consumers are interested in, watch those insights and trends, and then build our strategies around that. And that's really led us to conclude that we want to, given our scale and given our capability, that we want to invest in more prime, more dominant assets. So we have come out of some secondary, smaller scale assets dotted around the country, and we've reinvested 3 years ago that capital into blue water. In addition, we've put some more money this year into outlets. So we've just bought a portfolio of 3 new outlets, and we think that's a really interesting pocket of the market where we've got a proven track record on an existing asset within our portfolio, Gunwharf Quays, where we've really brought that to life, really turned new interesting experiences into and built that around retail brands, and our key customers are the retail and restaurant and leisure brands. So really working in partnership and in alignment with them has helped us turn that around in Gunwharf Quays, and we think we can do more of that in the outlet sector.
So Lawrence, it sounds like Ailish has been moving away from the secondary locations, the very areas that you're in, and I think a lot of people in this room will be interested to hear what your take on the market is, because I think you're fresh from Australia. So what's your perspective?
Well, thank you. Obviously, our investments are focused at the other end of the retail spectrum, and I think the retail market globally accepts that polarisation is taking place. That polarisation between the large venues, effectively, and the smaller, more local venues, and we're unashamedly investing in the smaller local venues, and we believe there's growth there. Basically, we're certainly enjoying very high levels of occupancy. We're seeing good rental growth. We're seeing very strong retailer demand. But I just wanted to pick up something. We talk about prime and secondary. This is the only market in the world where we refer to shopping centres that way. And having just run a series of focus groups with our shoppers, effectively, in Ilford and Maidstone, not one of them referred to our shopping centres as prime and secondary. So I think it's a really interesting point. It's something worth exploring at some stage, because our shoppers don't see it that way, our retailers don't see it that way. So, and we're very, very clear. We believe the two can cohabitate very nicely. In Ilford, for example, looking at the focus group reports and feedback, the customers completely get it. And they say to us, we go to Stratford to get these things, and we go once every 4 or 6 weeks, and we come to see you once or twice a week, and these are the things we expect and we want to see from you. So I think the customer really understands it, and as an industry, there's a real challenge for us to come up to speed.
I'm sure we'll come back to that a little later on. Richard, give us your take on the market right now.
Very broad question. I think from as Matthew touched on in his presentation, if you go to the kind of top of the market in terms of global capital flows, the investments into various asset classes, there is still a dominance of capital out there willing to invest in the UK. There has been less invested across that retail sector, but I think that's also because people have traded less assets. So, Ailish touched on it there. People are holding on to those assets. They're holding on to them to try to drive revenues through them, and they're doing that because ultimately, investors, global investors, are chasing. They're chasing income yields. Income yields are still, that property premium is still higher than the long-term average within the capital markets, and global investors still now have a view that they have that permanent allocation to real estate, which they didn't historically have. So I think at that level, I think the UK remains, pretty solid on a long-term basis in terms of it being an attractive asset class from an investment perspective. I think at a more granular level, the market has been slower. There has been less traded. I think there has been less development starts. I think those development starts have stalled for a number of reasons. If you're not Land Securities or British Land, with the level of capitalisation they have, you are reliant more on bank debt. The banks don't want to lend into speculative development, So you go kind of full circle. So I think there is less stock out there. There are less development starts, and I think that is leading to what feels like a much quieter market.
And Stephen, you don't own as much as you once did. You primarily invest other people's money. So can you talk me through, your portfolio? Obviously, you've got this huge scheme in Edinburgh underway. It's full steam ahead. No changes there under the current climate. Talk me through your portfolio.
The portfolio globally, we've got, as a business, we've got 100 billion invested in assets, and about a third of that is in retail property, and that's globally. So we have to ask ourselves, our clients can invest in anything. They could move to logistics, we could advise them to move to logistics, to industrial, wherever. So we have a very close eye on the business as to where retail is going and what's happening in retail, because our clients are all asking us, what is happening? What's happening with online? Where are we going? So we have to take a step back and say, do we really believe in retail? And Edinburgh, obviously at the forefront of that, is a big decision. And fundamentally the answer is yes, we do invest in retail, as we've touched on. One size definitely does not fit all. There are some fantastic, what Lawrence may not call secondary, but community centres, and there's some fantastic prime centres, but you can go wrong in each. So it's really understanding, it comes back to understanding the granular level of assets and how that city, how that town works. I think probably a good example is we've got a European cities fund that can only invest in the big European cities, of which we've narrowed that down to 40 across the whole of Europe, and there are 5 in the UK that can invest in retail or offices. So the scope in which you can invest now, in context, that invests in offices as well. The scope in which we are now looking is a lot smaller than it used to be. It might have been 20, 30 cities. It really has narrowed down considerably.
So why is investment activity down? How much of it is Brexit related, or is it more retail focused? Because there is demand from retailers for space. So why is there this disconnect? Eilish.
I was going to say, I think there's a real... I was in a strategy meeting with one of our partners, and there was a number of sovereign wealth funds there, and we touched on it, Matthew touched on the presentation, there is a real concern about America, and the perception is retail, forget it. You do not want to be invested in retail. And obviously the stats show there is more to it than that. It's a lot more complicated. But that perception counts for a lot. If you're putting forward a proposal to buy Blue Water to your main board, who haven't been to Blue Water, who don't understand the UK market, but they can see what's happening in America, they're going to take a step back. And so perception counts for a lot, and it's our job to say, actually, it is more complex than that. You need to understand the asset, you need to understand what's going on. But perception is an enormous part of the issue at the moment.
I mean, Matthew laid out quite clearly why the US is different, but doesn't it make you a little bit nervous, the winds of change that are blowing through American towns and cities? Sears on its knees, Macy's struggling, empty shopping malls. A little bit nervous, Eilish?
Absolutely not. However, we shouldn't ignore what we can learn, and Land Securities, we've always benchmarked internationally and looked outside to see what we can learn, to see what challenges we can understand in all markets. So we shouldn't ignore what we can learn from it, but clearly in Matthew's presentation, and it's sort of pretty well documented that there are some really key differences in our markets, definitely the tight supply, or a tighter supply than you would see in the US. And I think the really important question to ask ourselves going forward is around what are the future opportunities? What are the opportunities for reinvention of properties, for bringing the creativity, the talent, of which there are buckets of it in this industry, to these more challenged assets? And I think that's why you're seeing there will be some specialist organisations who can really focus on that sector and will find the opportunities and bring them forward. So I think it's really about looking forward, looking for the opportunities in the future out of the market that we're sitting in now.
So talking of buckets, so I often view retail in a 2-minute sort of news piece as one big bucket, whereas everyone in this room knows it's hugely varied. So I want to talk a little bit about the differentiation. So you're in prime, Stephen's in secondary. Can you both be right? Can you make money out of secondary locations?
As I mentioned earlier, I think both the retail market globally accepts that polarisation is happening. I think we all hear a lot because the large owners own large centres fundamentally, have a large share of voice or a larger voice. And we all understand the role of the super regional mall or town centre or city centre globally. That isn't the end of the retail universe, and the more retailers we meet, the more certain of that we are. And if you take a new chain, for example, Smiggle, just happens to be an Australian chain, it's arrived in the UK fresh, no legacy issues. We met with them the other day and they said, well, we've got 105 stores committed. I think if Nick Simons is in the room, he'll probably correct me. 105 stores committed, I think opened, they've got another 20 that they've signed. And I said, what's the right number? And he said 200 stores. And I said, why 200 stores? He said, you've got to understand, stores 30 to 200 are the engine room of the business from a profit standpoint. So I think the rarefied view that we're going to wake up one morning there's 30 or 40 locations for the vast majority of retailers is not right. And we know retailers are currently investing a lot of money in understanding what formats they need into these community markets, effectively, large retailers. So I believe they can cohabitate very successfully. I think they do today.
I mean, it seems like you're going to see this convergence of investment into prime locations above anything else, especially the big institutional sort of money. So obviously there are repercussions for lots of struggling sort of town centres, the repercussions of this focus on prime locations. But what are your thoughts on what do we do for these town centres that aren't going to get the big household names in the future? Stephen, I mean, obviously you've got Edinburgh, which is going to be, hugely influential, but of course that's going to take away from certain patches elsewhere in Edinburgh. I mean, that's not the sort of similar example, but how do we ensure prosperity in other places?
I think Edinburgh's not the greatest example
No,
because it's a capital city, but I would say in my previous life at Deutsche Bank, we bought shopping centres and market towns for German investors. So we bought a shopping centre in Market Harbour, we bought one in Whitney. And they are still in that portfolio and they are trading phenomenally well because they have got a food store anchor. They're nice, simple, open schemes. They don't have, the difference is they're having less of the big fashion, and Lawrence touched on Smiggle. I would counter that with saying, if you speak to someone like Superdry, who are a very good quality fashion retailer, speaking to their agent the other day, said they've got 97 shops, and that's all they need, because those 97 shops will service the whole country, and they can do their online, they can do their omni-channel through those 97 shops. And I think there's probably a difference, and Lawrence probably agree, between fashion retailers. So those market towns will not get those fashion retailers. They want the big prime units and the Edinburghs and the Bullrings of this world. And those smaller centres will have the Smiggles, they will have a coffee shop, they will have that. So to a degree, they have to reinvent themselves by default. A tight planning is vital. If you've got out of town in these small market towns, the town centre will die. It is simple as that. So as long as you've got a hub and very tight planning policy, that makes an enormous difference. I think the planners also have to look themselves very carefully as to where they want their retail. Do they want the community in town or a disparate retail community?
And Lawrence, give us a sense of when you're sniffing out opportunities, and there obviously are opportunities out there, what's mispriced? What's undervalued? Where are your red lines?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd say the entire sector is mispriced at the moment. I think markets are imperfect. If you look at, you can buy land securities at 30% discount, you can buy us at an 18% discount. If you then compare that to the direct trades that are happening in the market, that would suggest, I can't buy land securities or Hammerson assets at 6%, and yet I can buy access to those assets in the public markets. So I think they are mispriced. Certainly in our sector, what do we look for? Typically dominance within the markets that asset's located in. So we would preferably not be the non-dominant asset in that market. We're looking at the ability to re-merchandise very actively. So as Steve mentioned, I think the harsh realities will see less fashion. I think one of the things that's distinguished the UK market is the The smaller centres, I'll use the word secondary for a moment, were merchandised as just a smaller version of the large shopping centres. So they weren't tailored to how the end consumer wants to use these facilities. So can we re-merchandise? How quickly can we re-merchandise? Things like food store anchors are important to us. And obviously demographics are important, but that doesn't mean we're drawn to the best areas. Everyone needs to eat, everyone needs to shop. There are basic needs that most people have.
So it's not just demographics, it's disposable income. I mean, that's fundamental.
I think disposable income is fundamental. Things like the living wage and regulating the gig economy are also, as you would appreciate, for certain demographics are positives.
What do you think, Richard? Do you agree that sort of retail property, as Matthew put it, is all sort of tarred with the same brush? How polarised is it? What's your sense on the opportunities out there?
I think we've obviously demonstrated, and everyone knows it's very different, whether it's super regional, whether it's the secondary category, or if you come down to high street retail, which we haven't really talked about. And I think if you start to look at high street retail, again, that's different depending on where you look across the country. I think where touching on this, you do a St James, you do those big repositionings. It leaves redundant parts of these town centres, and those redundant parts of the town centres probably offer an opportunity to try and consolidate that historic retail space and reinvent that space. But when that space is reinvented, it needs to be reinvented, in my view, in a mixed-use context, because you can't just replace it with retail because there's not enough demand. If you just put residential back, which is historically what happened, that doesn't really reinvigorate that town centre. So with the particular scheme we're involved in Islington is I would say it's not a shopping centre. It is a natural extension of the existing high street. But what makes it, we believe, a real opportunity is that the complexity of assembling that land is significant. So that means it's underpriced really. You can put that together by taking that risk, and then ultimately its mixed use nature is what changes its dynamic really. So you end up with this continuum of the high street, which is attractive to people who want to typically be on that high street. You've got a ready-made community in terms of the residential that's within it, and I personally believe that's where the opportunities are, taking those elements of town centres, the old high street stock, doing things that are complicated, putting it together and turning those things into longer term sustainable sort of developments, which will then attract those bigger global capital flows, because they'll see them as estate plays. This is something that you can drive income through, over a 10-year period, etc., etc. So that's where we've been trying to focus. But it is complex, and it comes to planning, it comes to land assembly, it comes to ownership. It's not easy, and you can see with the big firms like Land Securities have been putting stuff like this together for 15, 20 years. But I do believe those opportunities are out there, irrespective of, with them being prime sort of gateway cities or them being secondary cities.
You say it's not easy, but a lot of people will think, well, it's pretty easier in Islington than other parts of the countries, because you've got retailers who will be falling over themselves to get into your nice new development.
Nice if they were.
Far easier than other parts of the country. I mean, Stephen, how tricky is it to persuade retailers at the moment to come into your schemes? Obviously, Edinburgh is a pretty special case. No trouble there.
It's increasingly difficult, is the truth of it, and you speak to any leasing agent, they say it will be difficult for all the reasons we know. There are some real headwinds these retailers are facing. The minimum wage, or the living wage, the inflation that they're faced with, the cost of importing goods, and that's hitting fashion really, really hard. So it's not easy for retailers. They've been really selective. They don't have to open 50 units a year. So it is very, very difficult. As you say, I think we all know that the larger centres are where they tend to be attracted, and it is more difficult the further you go down. But I do think that, again, you're generalising it. Sometimes those towns which are, it's difficult to categorise retail centres, but those towns between 50 and 100, where the rents are quite high, are probably more difficult to attract in occupiers than maybe the centres which the rents are 30, 40 pounds zone A and the rent rolls 30 or 40,000. So it's that middle ground which can be a really, really difficult place where it doesn't fit quite one thing or the other.
Yeah, that's a difficult area,
Yeah,
isn't
it's really
it? The
tough.
squeezed middle, and sometimes I wonder whether, some retailers would just like to take a magic wand and vanish, a large part of their portfolio. So, Ailish, I mean, how do you see it? Because of course you've got an interesting scheme that's going to spring into life. Oxford, tell us a little bit about that, and how tricky was that to get going?
Absolutely. Well, as everyone who's been involved in developments in city centres knows, that it's very tricky, it takes a long time to put together, and I think that Richard has described the process very well there. But we're at the very end of that journey right now, because we're about to open the centre next month in Westgate and Oxford. And actually, it's a really great story of reinventing an older sort of underutilised site and shopping centre in Oxford. And we think that it's going to really add to the historic context, the beauty of Oxford, but also bringing in, a really great mix of, British and international brands. But also it's not just retail, it's going to be quite leisure focused as well. So I think it's going to demonstrate the future of retail in many ways, in that it's really more of a blending of an experience for customers, and that's, we've rebranded as Everything is Experience at Land Securities, creating experiences for customers, and also not just shoppers, but the brands need to really experience that and really buy into what your product is. And I think that crosses across the whole sector, really. Even at the large dominant assets which are popular at retailers, and we will see, we've seen established brands like Next and H&M upsizing their stores at Bluewater, which is great news, and we see international brands coming in. But it's really that focus on continuing to work with the brands and finding new brands, new products, things, there's always going to be things that are falling off relevance in the world, in prime, and however we describe the location. So, but I think at Bluewater that now you can buy lots of things that you couldn't previously buy: a Tesla car, a Dyson hairdryer, which I'd love to get my hands on. These things are, there's lots of new things that are happening all the time. And in local cities, you will find lots of interesting entrepreneurs who are in local towns who are interested in coming into your retail spaces at all ends of the spectrum. So I think it's really focusing on that, what is making it really engaging, vibrant, why are people going to come to your centre, large or small?
Stephen, your scheme in Edinburgh, I mean, how much food and beverage, how much leisure is going to be in that scheme? And is that a scheme that you're looking to deliver strong capital growth, rental growth? What's it going to do for you?
It's going to deliver all of the above, I hope.
Yes.
It is, the leisure element is high. It's about 25-30%, depending on how you measure it, which is probably about what anyone in this room would say you need nowadays for a scheme. It's also got a cinema. We're also joint owners of the Bullring with Hammerson. That's 15 years old, and the leisure content is significantly less. And if you did that again, you would have a far higher leisure F&B content. So that part of it is extremely important, because there's a big tourism population in Edinburgh which we need to capture, and you want to hold people within your centre, and you want to make it, as Ailish has said, a great experience, and that is part of it. It's got to be, the word keeps coming up, it's got to be experiential. And in terms of ownership and how you want to own, our joint owners on Edinburgh and the funding partners, APG, and APG's time horizon is 20 odd years, and I think we've touched on it, that a lot of these big pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they're not looking at a small time horizon, which is why they tend to focus on the big cities. They solely focus on the big cities. They're looking forward 20, 25 years. They don't run a 5-year cash flow. They are looking a long way forward, and how is that going to interact? So you may have, yields might move out of it. It doesn't really matter in the short term. It's that security of income, and can we continue to keep the shopping centre let? Can we keep it vibrant? I think the big question for us as landlords is how we can capture that income going forward, because it is changing, because we know a lot of it is online. So a retailer might turn around to us, and I don't know the answer to this, and say, we'll do turnover only. And we'll say, yeah, but what about your catchment population? Because there's this halo effect, which has been well publicised, from having the store. Turnover only from a store may not work, because that person who orders 10 goods online, they deliver them, 9 of them back to the store, and that's taken off the bottom line. So as a landlord, that sits pretty uncomfortably with me. So I think there's got to be, we're looking at all sorts of revenue streams, more than RMUs and everything else now. So I think the whole essence of what we're doing as investors has become a lot more sophisticated on how we're looking at things, how we're looking at income streams. But the answer to the question is a long-term commitment. It has to be. It's not over 5 years.
I think that's quite an interesting, if not controversial idea, looking at sort of total turnover. How do you value online sales in the whole piece? Is that something Landsec would think about, and not so much community centres, I suppose, because that's the day-to-day, everyday essential spending.
It's interesting, we're still seeing it. We formed a partnership with Collect Plus. We operate that through our customer service desk. Growth in parcel collections is almost 40%. And the number one boxes that go, or parcels that go through, are ASOS and Amazon. There's no surprises there. Is that something we're worried about? No. As part of being integral to those local communities, that's a service we need to offer. We're very relaxed about it. And then on the other hand, we've just had some research done in one of our centres, and a couple of our fashion stores are seeing about 30 to 40% of their total volume in returns back through our store. So what's happening is they're going to the nearest super regional mall, a Blue Water or a Stratford or a Westfield London. They're buying their fashion, they're on their fashion trip, they do that once every 6 weeks or so, or 8 weeks, whatever it is, and then they return them with us. And we say, is that a problem? It's not a problem. We speak to the retailers. The retailers are absolutely aware of the role that our store plays in their ecosystem in terms of servicing their customer. And they know it's cheaper to have it returned to the store than the alternative, which is that the customer will say, come and collect it, and the reverse logistics and the state of the product and their ability to put it back into the supply chain is a huge issue for them. So I think we play an integral role in that whole click and collect piece, and it's something that we just need to be growing up about and say, look, we're going to rely on the fact that the retailers understand the value of these stores within their broader customer ecosystem.
But don't you worry in 10 years' time that all your shoppers will be able to do the day-to-day by the click of a button, especially with the mighty Amazon getting into groceries and everything?
I think that's fascinating, but we've just seen Amazon pay $12 billion US for a physical retailer, the world's most successful online retailer. Someone said to me the other day they paid $12 billion for the mailing list so they could sign more members. I think it'd have to be the most expensive database in the world on that basis. I've seen other reports, that's clearly not why they bought it. They understand logistics are important. They understand that omni-channel retailing is where the growth is. So I think when you see the largest single pure play online retailer buying a physical network, I think that says something. And I think we're very clear on it. We're at the intersection where people meet product, and we think that intersection remains very, very viable and important. If we contemplated a world where you only bought things online, I think consumption would be a third of where it is today. The physical retail plays a very important role in stimulating demand. We've all been to the stores recently and we've seen things that we didn't know we want. We didn't know we needed them fundamentally, and sometimes we didn't need them when we get them home. But the harsh reality is that physical retail plays such an important role, and it's clear that many of the pure play online retailers are realising the importance of a physical representation of their product and brand.
People want to interact. You know, it's interesting. Parallel, if you look at the commercial office sector, and if you go back 10 years. One of the big objectives for employers was obviously flexible working. You can work from home, et cetera, and all this home working started, and people were working out of their spare bedroom or whatever. And if you look at where we are today, the fastest growing business in the world from a commercial office leasing perspective is WeWork. And WeWork's whole customer base, their whole philosophy is based on people want to interact. They don't want to sit at home in their bedroom. They want convenience, they want flexibility. And everyone is now looking at this whole co-working concept and trying to see how it works. So again, the other thing is people want to interact. So fundamentally with retail, whether it's that broader leisure experience, whether it's just the physically seeing the goods, people want to go in. People do want to have that interaction because they're human beings at the end of the day. So there are trends, but I do think longer term we've gone back to much more of a, people want that interaction experience, and all that the online is really doing is giving you, it's almost like you're doing your research and then you're going for the interaction. It doesn't capture everybody, but I think it's a bigger cultural shift just generally in both the commercial sector and just the consumer sector, really.
Good point. It's perhaps a good time just to throw this open to the floor to see if you have any particular questions you'd like to ask this fabulous panel. So stick your hand up in there. We've got a microphone roaming around. Great. Gentleman at the front, second row, if we could get a microphone or shout. Okay, I think you're going to have to... Oh, here we go. And just say who you'd like to direct your question to.
Actually, I think it's to everybody. Eilish talked about relevance. I'm just wondering if you could put yourself 15, 20, 30 years into the future, what's going to be relevant in our shopping centres?
Eilish.
Absolutely. Well, I think what's going to be relevant is that we have created a product and a place and a space that people are really happy to come and visit because it meets their needs on a convenience, and fundamental needs are met, whether that is eating, shopping, etc., collecting things, dropping things off. But also it's something that really is relevant in their lives, something that really speaks to them. So I think whatever product and however our centres look in the future, it's got to be driven by a customer-focused and insight-driven strategy that we evolve, and we're doing that all the time. And the large-scale assets, they're not immune to change, they're not immune to structural change. You've got to be listening to your customers. In fact, their expectations when they've driven an hour are very high, and what you've got to provide them. So at Land Securities, we've got a Share Your Thoughts program, which is basically it's an ongoing day-to-day live program where customers can feed in their experiences from their visit to our centres, and that live data is daily looked at and built into how we pivot our operations, sometimes a tiny bit, sometimes a lot, based on customer insight and customer feedback. So I think the future will be driven by two things: one, that insight, and secondly, creativity, and us coming up with more ideas and more ways of creating vibrant places and exciting, interesting, also relaxing, also convenient. So it's really, real estate is always for people to enjoy, and the people will vote with their feet based on what you've come up with, I think.
So Lawrence, presumably you don't want excitement. You have a different vision. Where are you going to be in 10 years, 20 years' time?
I think experience is still important. It's just we're in a different end of the experience market. Fundamentally, I don't think anyone wants to have a poor experience when they go to their local community centre. I don't think a large proportion of our market is mothers, effectively, in many of the centres that we own. They don't want an adverse experience when they use the parents' change rooms. They don't want an adverse experience in the car parks. They want somewhere for the child to play. They want somewhere they can have a coffee and a break. They want to interact with other people, other mothers potentially. They want to buy relevant things. So we still believe we're in the experience business, but it's just in a different type of experience. It's not the oh wow, or I've got Justin Bieber on stage this Thursday night, or whatever it is. We're in a different market, but experience is still important, and we need to make it pleasurable to people. Because fundamentally, if it's not relevant and it's not easy to use and it's not a pleasure to use, then there is an alternate channel. In terms of the future, challenging. No one knows. We can't see around the corner. We don't know what the next piece of technological advancement is or innovation. But if you look at the history for a second, the number one growth retailer in the world has not been Amazon or ASOS. It's been Domino's Pizza. By a margin, by fourfold Amazon, fundamentally. So there is an omni-channel retailer. I think it's about being digitally aware, about embracing technology. We can use it to our advantage in our businesses. We do. We've got great databases. Many of the largest centers are in Bullring. We pioneered that, Steve, I think probably 10 years ago. And you do a lot through social media. It's a great way to connect with people. So I think in terms of the future, the experience market's still relevant. Things that you want to do in person. We still believe that discretionary items like fashion and giftware, there'll be a need to showcase that in some form of physical environment. And the things that we need, services, other items, it's very hard to see technology providing you with a haircut or doing your nails or these sorts of things. I hate to think. I'm sure there's someone working in an accelerator somewhere in New York or Berlin or working on how they can solve that, but we don't see that changing in a hurry.
So less fashion, more services. So in a way, your anchor tenant could be a post office or service driven.
Correct, and I still think the grocery market is an interesting one. I think any business that's got a low margin, high volume, that's a hard business to run online, fundamentally, very hard business to run online. You know, I was with Tom Meager the other day from Primark. He was saying they don't have any intention of creating a transactional website. Their idea of a nightmare is someone buying 3 pairs of socks in Grimsby and wanting to return them because they're better off calling him and telling him to put them in the bin and they'll send the refund. So the reverse logistics just don't work in that format. So I'd say we just don't subscribe to the view we're going to wake up one morning and there's no shops or there's 30 shopping malls in the UK and that's it. We just don't subscribe to that view.
Stephen, what's your view?
Just taking some of the points forward, I think if anything you read about Amazon, they'll say they're all about the consumer. And I think we can learn a lot from that. It's not just they're online, it's all about the consumer service. And I think we've come a long way in the shopping centre industry in that, and we've still got a long way to go. But we talk about that on Edinburgh because it's 3 years till it opens, so we've got that opportunity. But things, and we're touching what Ailish was saying, it's so important that someone has the right experience because people are so demanding now. No matter what age group, they are demanding and they expect the best. As Lauren said, you expect the best car park. You don't want to queue up to get out. You expect everything to happen seamlessly. And you've got to provide that service. And just from a personal example, my wife was shopping at Hammerson Scheme recently. She does a lot of work with people with dementia, and the security guards are all trained to be dementia friends. And she was staggered by this. And I think that level of service has got to be throughout the whole scheme. So from the day, from when a person first walks in the scheme, whether they come by bus, train, whatever, whether they drive in, they've got to have a good experience. And that, you know, for smaller centres, community centres, it may be more difficult, but for the larger centres, you've got to provide that service because people expect it. The one thing I would say, and this is a whinge at retailers, is I think retailers also have a lot to learn. You know, I stood in queues in certain retailers with my daughter thinking, why am I in a queue of 20 people? Why is there not someone wandering around with an iPad just paying and we're walking out? So I think there's a lot of work in the industry to be done as well, that the retailers also have to look at themselves and say, how can we turn people around quicker? How can we make the experience better? We can do our bit, and by bringing them into the centre, they also have to look at how their operations run and how can they make it more efficient.
And how much more creative you have to be. I don't know if there's anything interesting that you're going to be experimenting with in the St James's Centre. For instance, you know, in these big, shiny shopping centres, is there going to be room for pop-ups, small businesses, independents, to try and add a bit of extra interest?
Yeah, no, we've talked about that, and it's not easy because ultimately, let's be honest, it's a commercial beast. We've got to generate revenue. It's costing 750 million to build it. You need a return on that. So, but there is room, and you've got to do it. And I know Hammerson have experimented it and done a fair bit on it, and they've done it in the Bull Ring, and it's worked successfully. So yes, you have to look at that, but it has to be measured because it doesn't always work. It's not a panacea, but you've got to look at trying to make things slightly different and for people to see different things. And move tenants around, and it might mean shorter lease lengths, and our landlord's brave enough to have shorter lease lengths. It's happening maybe naturally in the market anyway, so you may find a turnover of tenants just occurs because of the way the market's moving anyway.
What are your typical length leases in Edinburgh then?
We're 3 years out, so we've done a larger store.
But you didn't anticipate.
But in a typical centre, a good centre, probably when I started out was a 15-year lease with 5-year rent reviews. It's probably now a 10-year lease with a mutual break in year 5 if you're a good centre, or a tenants only break if you're not such a good centre. And in smaller centres, it's probably less than 5 years. So the lease length and the flexibility is there, but retailers are remarkably resilient. Lawrence's occupancy is probably 95% plus. In the bigger centres, it's 98%. And that's across Europe. So there's remarkable resilience across the board, actually.
I think that's one of the reasons. I think in America they have incredibly short leases, so you see this churn that you. That's another reason why you wouldn't see the same sort of fallout sort of happening here.
Yeah. I mean, the institutional lease structure in the UK has undoubtedly helped investment because people can look into it and see a long-term income flow.
So, Richard, give me your crystal ball. What are you seeing? 20 years out, 10 years out? What's it going to look like?
I still, I go back to what I said earlier. I still believe that, the opportunity to kind of create these mixed-use, reinvent these mixed-use locations, an extension of the high street. I think that is more what people will ultimately want. I think that there will always be the home, for sure, for the big super-regional shopping centre and the bigger shopping centres, because everything's in one place. You can go there, you can get it. It appeals to the widest sort of generation, but I don't think it's not the same. I don't think you can ever create in those environments the same experience that you will create in a more town centre mixed-use environment. And I think, if you look at how residential plays into it, how you look at how people use public spaces, this idea that more people live in, city centres, and it does differ obviously across the country. But I think there is a huge opportunity there, and I think if people can get their head around taking the risk and actually, getting more creative about reinventing those locations, accepting that you will have to have shorter leases, you will have to have, in the earlier days, a lower return on your capital. If you can we can get the lending sector, the banks, for example, to wake up and realise that they're a waste of space. Lenders are just a waste of space. They will not underwrite risks such as 5-year leases. They're just not going to do it. So you've got to have capital that's prepared to take those risks. And I do think that capital will increasingly come into the market to do it. You just need. So my view would be that 20 years from now, we should see a lot more of that, provided there's enough people out there with ideas and the right capital structure and ambition to do it. I think it'd be a great thing to see, and I don't think it takes away the Edinburghs and the Blue Waters or the Maidstones or anything else. I still think they play a part in it, but I think it'd be a great thing to see.
Do we have any other questions? No? And so that leads me on to the Brexit question, because we've gone through the whole hour barely talking about it. I mean, Lawrence, you must have felt that you landed in a different country when you came back from the one that you left. What's your sense on the Brexit effect? Are you sort of depressed, sensing sort of opportunities? What are your thoughts? Is it just noise? I mean, everyone here, you're all going to say we're in it for the long term, but right now, the next few years, what do you think?
Having lived through the 90s recession and then the GFC, I don't think there's much that can derail the confidence. It was our decision to come back to the UK. We love it here. We had a great 13 years. I think this is a fabulous retail market. I think it leads the world, to be honest with you. Online penetration is the highest in the UK. In my travels with Blackstone across Asia, didn't matter which market I arrived in, the successful offshore retailers were almost always British retailers. So as opposed, the Americans have had less success traveling globally. So I think this is an incredibly advanced retail market. If you want to play your trade anywhere, I can't think of anywhere that I would rather be in. I think it's a great market. And Great Britain's been Great Britain for a long time, fundamentally, far longer than it's been a member of the European Union. Certainly appreciate that there's going to be some turbulence along the way, and we fully accept that. But we're not seeing a great impact in our footfall. We're not seeing a great impact in retailer demand. We're still writing business outside at our stand today. That continues. So I just think it's one of these things that's going to evolve fundamentally. We don't know whether it's hard Brexit, soft Brexit, somewhere in between. It's just business as usual. The thing I'm encouraged by is we're all in the same position. It's not something that affects Capital and Regional. It's not something that just affects the property market. I think it's just something we need to live with and need to work our way through, to be honest.
Is it business as usual at Landsec? How are your shoppers feeling?
Yes, it is business as usual, and of course, you can always expect some uncertainty will come about, whatever the reason is. In this case, we've got Brexit, and that's always driving how we're building resilience into our portfolio. I think actually what we have had experience of in the outlet sector is that that's actually been a pocket of sort of outperformed quite significantly in the last downturn. And it's interesting that some parts of the retail market, people don't stop shopping, even when you'll see reports of confidence, consumer confidence down. We still see people coming out every day. In fact, the weekend after Brexit was a phenomenal footfall weekend at some of our centres, and obviously it was voted by our shoppers in the majority. So I think we're not noticing that it's particularly causing an issue right now. I think it's important more for us to work with the retail brands who maybe there is some impacts on, and to ensure that we're understanding what they are and understanding how they're going to impact their businesses going forward.
And what about you two? The Brexit effect, is there one? Will there be one?
I think there obviously is one, in the sense that if you touch on the point before about, with retailers today, if you were talking to a retailer today to even take space 1 year out, which is the situation we have, if they're a European retailer, they have a view, and and they may use that as a reason, they may use it as a negotiating tool. So it does feel like there's a real issue there. But I think that we've kind of, Lawrence said, we've had all these various events. We got used to it. What does it really mean? And I think day in, day out today, there is that lack of a little bit of hesitation and pause from people. But I don't think it'll be. I don't think it's sustainable. I think that we will get on with things, and hopefully that confidence will return for people to make business commitments. I think that we are a US-backed private equity investment fund. Their view is this market here, if you're looking at private equity returns, will continue to deliver 10% plus returns in all sectors, and actually Brexit's a fantastic opportunity.
And what are
so they're different perspective.
Sorry, what are your investors saying then?
It's interesting how European investors are quite comfortable with it. I think we've been in Europe all long enough to know that Europe's an interesting place to do business, and things change. So they understand it, and so they're more concerned about online retailing and those effects, whereas investors outside Europe, I think, are far more concerned. So Australian and Asian investors, we found, are far more concerned about Brexit, and they will be delaying investment decisions to see what happens, whereas the Europeans, as everyone else says, will just get on with it. We know what you're about. You'll be fine. There will be a couple of difficult years, and that will be okay. But there seems to be a not a so certain sentiment from overseas or investors outside of Europe.
I think interest rates are a bigger concern. Interest rates are real, and if interest rates hit people, hit the mortgage market, and the mortgage market moves, that hits real consumers. It hits their pockets, and they've got less money to spend. I think that's a bigger concern.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but maybe I can squeak one final quick question to all of you. I mean, there clearly is money out there, so perhaps we can round off by asking all of you very, very quickly, how can that money best be captured for retail? Ailish, what do you think? How do we get that money into retail?
Well, I think a compelling business case for whatever and this is the lovely thing about real estate, that it's probably going to come down to looking at asset or portfolio level to really get true insight to understand what the opportunities are, and obviously it's got to be commercial if it's going to attract money. So we've been able to build a business case internally to buy 3 new outlets earlier this year. We're building business cases all the time to invest in extensions and enhancements of our shopping centres. So I believe that there will be lots of opportunities. There are still plenty of retailers, leisure operators, new concepts coming into the UK all the time, and new concepts emerging within the UK. And it's going to be that demand for real estate that will build those great compelling business cases that will help those funders, whether that's internal or external funders, to put more investment into the retail sector.
Lawrence?
work harder at being relevant to the communities in which we operate, build stronger working relationships with our retailer customers. That'll deliver income growth. If we can continue to demonstrate high occupancy and income growth, capital will come back to our markets. So I think that's very much our focus.
Stephen?
I think just having a totally open mind as to what can be done. It's not just a matter of leasing shops to your standard retailers. It's looking at other avenues. Is it putting residential in? Is it F&B, which we've touched upon? Student accommodation, anything. It's looking at these are valuable assets in the middle of communities, and a lot can be done with them. So I think it's opening our minds up as to what more can be done with that land which we own in the city centre.
Richard, you've got the final thought.
I think it's about opportunity. I think if you can find the opportunity, you've got the right people behind it, the right ideas and the confidence, and believe in kind of the broader partnership of everybody in it, the money will be there. You know, the capital will come.
What a good thought to end up on. Thank you so much, panellists. You've been absolutely fantastic. I wonder if you could give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. And it's time for lunch, and hope to see a lot of you back in the afternoon because we've got 2 more panels in the afternoon. So thanks very much, and get your sandwich.